Kill them. Kill all of them. Leave nothing standing. Colonel Viktor Volkov delivered the order with a chilling quietness that was somehow worse than a scream. He pressed his heavy boot against the wounded American soldier's shattered chest, staring down at the man's ruined face with absolute, terrifying apathy, and fired twice. Smoothing the lapels of his heavy coat, he raised his binoculars toward the frozen outpost huddled 4 kilometers further up the treacherous mountain. A cruel smile touched his lips. 10 exhausted men, 1 dying generator, and absolutely no way out. He keyed his radio. "Advance full column. They cannot stop us." 31 armored vehicles roared to life, churning the frozen earth. Not a single man among them noticed the silent woman already draped across the icy roof high above them. Hidden beneath a thermal veil, watching through a high-powered scope, she was completely still, entirely invisible, and quietly deciding who was going to die first. Author's note. Before we delve deeper into the storm, if this is your first time joining us, please subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss a tale of survival. Drop a comment right now and let me know which city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. I'm your narrator, Tony DeMon. Now, let's return to that unforgiving mountain, because what happened next defied every military analyst, escaped the history books, and remains a secret kept by the few who survived it. The coffee was already cold by the time Staff Sergeant Silas Vance poured it. That was the clearest indicator that the generator was failing again. The heating coil in the field kitchen only operated when the power held above 60% capacity, and for the past 3 days it had violently struggled to maintain 40. Vance stood in the claustrophobic corridor between stacked supply crates and the eastern wall of the forward operating base. He gripped his metal cup with both hands, not for warmth, as there was none to be found, but because the simple ritual anchored him while his mind raced through statistics he desperately wanted to ignore. 10 soldiers. 1 base, a single access road, no air support, no hope of reinforcement for at least 72 hours, and that grim estimate relied on the storm clearing on schedule, which Rocky Mountain blizzards notoriously never did. He set the cup down untouched. Private First Class Julian Pierce appeared in the doorway, his erratic breaths fogging the freezing air. Pierce's eyes held a specific, haunting look, the unmistakable terror of a young soldier who has just witnessed something on a monitor that he cannot find the words to describe without making it worse. "You need to come see the thermal feed." Vance followed him without a single word. The operations room was practically a closet, barely large enough for 4 people to stand shoulder to shoulder. It housed 2 flickering monitors, a temperamental satellite relay that dropped its signal constantly, a fold-out table buried under topographic maps, and a coffee-stained logbook. Vance had been meticulously recording every radio contact and vehicle count by hand. He hadn't started a second notebook because the veteran instinct that had kept him alive through 3 previous deployments whispered that he probably wouldn't live long enough to need one. Private Delgado stood frozen at the thermal monitor. She stepped aside before Vance could ask. The image was grainy, chewed up by storm interference, but the horrific truth was perfectly clear. The winding eastern mountain road, the solitary artery connecting their outpost to the rest of the world, was no longer empty. It was crawling. "How many vehicles?" Vance asked, his voice deadened by dread. "Confirmed count is 31, Delgado replied, her voice trembling. "But the signal keeps dropping. There could be more behind the ridgeline. Infantry, walking escort on both flanks, maybe 80 personnel on foot. Maybe more." Vance stood rooted to the floor. He pressed a flattened palm against the table, His eyes locked on the creeping thermal blobs and performed the instinctive, brutal arithmetic of a combat soldier. The math of survival, the math of time and impossible odds. He arrived at the exact same conclusion he'd held for 3 days, only now the Grim Reaper had attached a definitive deadline. "Wake everyone up," Vance ordered, his voice suddenly sharp and authoritative. "Full kit. I want every man on a defensive position in 15 minutes. "Even, Hayes?" Pierce asked. The silence that followed wasn't long, but it was heavy. It was the kind of loaded pause that occurs when a name is spoken that the entire room has subconsciously filed away in a completely separate, untouchable category. "Yes," Vance said firmly. "Even Hayes, the anomaly." Corporal Harper Hayes had arrived at the outpost 8 days prior on the final resupply chopper before the blizzard swallowed the mountain. Her transfer paperwork had cleared through standard channels, routine unit rotation medical assignment. Nothing ostensibly raised a red flag. She was listed as a field medic, combat trained with 2 years of service. Her conduct was flawless. She executed every order flawlessly, complained about nothing, and caused 0 friction. She also almost never spoke. In her time there, Vance could count on one hand the number of full sentences she had uttered that weren't strictly clinical. She had efficiently stitched a gash on Private Navarro's arm, treated Pierce for mild frostbite, and evaluated Sergeant Beckett for a severe stress fracture. In every instance, she was precise, incredibly efficient, and unnervingly quiet, asking only what was medically necessary. She ate her meals in total isolation, usually facing a wall at the far end of the mess table. She slept on the top bunk in the women's quarters, shared only with Private Clara Sterling, and kept her personal locker sealed with a custom combination that defied all standard military override codes. But what unsettled the unit the most was her luggage. Harper Hayes owned a single piece of non-standard gear, a matte black hard-shell carrying case. It was roughly 130 centimeters long, reinforced at the corners, and secured with a highly customized closure system. She had lugged it off the helicopter herself. The processing sergeant had barely glanced at her medic designation before waving her through. It now rested under her bunk, shrouded in shadow. Delgado had once dared to ask about it. "Hey, Hayes, what's in the long case?" Hayes had stared back, not coldly, nor with hostility, but with an endless, unreadable patience, as if the question was a minor data point to process rather than a probe to deflect. "Medical equipment," she had answered softly. "Specialized for extreme field conditions." Delgado had nodded and walked away, later admitting to Sterling that she'd accepted the lie simply because there was a profound, undefinable stillness about Hayes that made questioning her feel like a disruption of the natural order. On the morning the enemy armor began its ascent, Vance specifically sent Pierce to wake Hayes. It wasn't based on concrete evidence, but rather the quiet, persistent calculations of his survivor's instinct. She was the one variable he could not predict, and unpredictable variables needed to be accounted for. Pierce knocked on the door to the women's quarters. Silence. He pushed it open. Sterling was already awake, frantically lacing her combat boots. She paused and stared up at the empty top bunk. The thermal blanket was perfectly folded, the pillow barely creased. "She's already gone," Sterling whispered. Pierce's eyes darted to the space beneath the bed. The long black case was missing. I don't know. I woke up a few minutes ago. She wasn't here." When Pierce delivered the news, Vance's outward reaction was masterfully controlled. Internally, a cold, jagged spike of terror pierced his chest. Not because a soldier had slipped out before roll call, but because the puzzle pieces he had been unconsciously assembling for 8 days finally snapped together. An enemy column was closing in. A 130-centimeter case was missing. and a ghost had vanished into the blizzard. "Where's Beckett?" Vance snapped. "Eastern wall," Pierce replied. "Tell him to sweep the exterior, all rooftops, all elevated positions." Pierce blinked, stunned. "You think she's on a roof?" "I think she's been studying our rooftops since the second she stepped off that bird. Yes, I think she's on a roof." As Pierce rushed off, Vance stood alone in the freezing hallway. A medic with a non-standard rifle case and a quiet obsession with elevated terrain had vanished into a whiteout storm without a trace. Those facts pointed to a highly specific, exceedingly lethal type of person. And Vance was now utterly certain that Harper Hayes was no medic. "Vance," Delgado's voice cracked through the earpiece. "The column is accelerating. Lead vehicle is out a couple of kilometers. Estimated contact in 20, maybe 25 minutes, depending on the ice." "Copy," Vance said. He moved to his command post, delivering crisp, measured orders to his remaining 8 soldiers. He commanded them to hold their ground, conserve their meager ammunition, and wait for his explicit signal to fire. He told them they were going to survive, not because he believed a word of it, but because a leader's duty in the shadow of certain death is to deliver hope with absolute conviction. They needed a miracle. He didn't realize that their miracle was currently lying face down in the deep snow, 400 meters to his north. The math of waiting. Atop the collapsed roof of an abandoned storage facility, swathed in a makeshift ghillie suit woven from thermal matting and shredded netting, Harper Hayes was completely invisible to both the naked eye and military thermal scanners. She looked like nothing more than a jagged snowdrift. She had been completely motionless in the biting freeze for over 2 hours. The cold had long since bypassed mere agony, settling deep into her bones as a crushing structural ache. But her hands remained perfectly, miraculously warm. She had been taught by instructors whose names did not exist on any official registry that when your body fails, the instrument remains, and the hands are the instrument. She had already mapped the kill zone twice. The primary engagement corridor, a sharp, treacherous curve where the armor would be forced to slow down, sat exactly 3,240 meters away. She had run this calculation on her very first morning, staring blankly out a frosted window, looking for all the world like a bored medic watching the snow. She hadn't been watching the snow. She had been building her shot. For Harper, the rifle was merely the final keystroke. The true labor was the wind mapping the atmospheric density calculations, the behavioral analysis of the enemy's leadership. That was the art. Right now, she wasn't running numbers. She was waiting. And waiting to Harper was a highly active state. It was a form of profound listening. She listened to the rhythmic, cyclical breathing of the mountain winds. She felt the subtle drops in temperature that would warp her bullet's drag. She monitored her own heartbeat, letting it slow to a languid, ghostly crawl. In the distance, she heard the heavy mechanical grind of armored tracks chewing through frozen gravel. She heard an arrogant army that believed itself untouchable. Down in the base, young Clara Sterling gripped her rifle at the eastern sandbags, her jaw locked. 19 years old, she had enlisted purely to fund nursing school. She never imagined her life would end in a Rocky Mountain blizzard staring down the barrel of a Russian armored division. She thought of her mother. She thought of her little brother. And then, strangely, she thought of Harper's perfectly made empty bed. That flat, neat absence steadied her trembling hands. She didn't know what Harper was, but the missing case whispered a promise. This story is not over. Vehicle count update. Delgado's voice rang tight in their earpieces. They're not slowing down. Hold positions, Vance ordered. High above, Harper found the lead commander in her crosshairs. Colonel Viktor Volkov stood arrogant and upright in the primary hatch, his binoculars pressed to his eyes. A 30-year veteran who had survived ambushes by burying himself beneath burning wreckage, Volkov knew what a defeated outpost looked like. He saw the damaged base, the pathetic handful of men, and he smiled. He relayed a joke to his radio operator, and they both laughed. 4 kilometers above the tree line, the howling crosswinds died for exactly 2 seconds. Atmospheric pressure noted. Temperature adjusted. Wind hold 0. Elevation correction applied. Harper did not rush. She found the sacred space between her own breaths, the void where the body is perfectly suspended, requiring no effort, demanding no oxygen. She slipped into the gap and gently pulled the trigger. The suppressed rifle spat a custom-machined round that tore through the thin atmosphere faster than the speed of sound. The shot was quieter than a whisper. At this staggering elevation, the bullet practically defied physics. It existed in the chamber, and then, a microsecond later, it existed inside its target. Colonel Viktor Volkov dropped without a single sound. There was no dramatic Hollywood flailing. He simply ceased to exist as a standing object. His binoculars swung gently by their strap against the cold steel of the hatch. The lead vehicle rolled forward for 4 sickening seconds before slamming its brakes. The enemy radios exploded into a chaotic symphony of panic. Down in the outpost, Sterling heard the sudden, violent screeching of tracks and the muffled echoes of shouting. It was the unmistakable audio signature of sheer terror. Delgado's face paled as she stared at the thermal feed. "The lead vehicle has stopped," she whispered. "Sergeant, they've stopped." Vance lunged to the monitor. The enemy column was violently compressing. The secondary vehicles were piling up behind the paralyzed leader, bottlenecked on the treacherous, icy incline. 80 infantrymen froze, desperately scanning the whiteout for an enemy they couldn't see. 31 vehicles of death had been halted in 30 seconds. "What stopped them?" Pierce gasped. No one answered. But up on the roof, Harper had already found her second target. An ambitious secondary commander had leaped from his armor, sprinting toward Volkov's vehicle with his radio raised, determined to clear the perceived mechanical failure and restore order. He was a good soldier. He would have had them moving in 5 minutes. He felt nothing. He was simply there, and then he was gone. The entire column ground to a permanent, terrified halt. The calculus of fear. Inside the cramped operations room, Silas Vance felt a fragile, alien emotion piercing his chest. It was the sharp edge of hope. "I think someone is shooting," Delgado breathed. "I know," Vance said, his eyes glued to the screen. "From where?" Vance stared at the impossible geometry playing out on the monitor. From somewhere they were never supposed to exist. Sterling exhaled a shaky breath, her mind racing back to the empty bunk. And on the frozen roof, the quiet woman they all thought they knew was calmly chambering her 3rd round, working with the terrifying precision of a phantom who had done this on countless other mountains, under a dozen other names. The enemy radio frequencies began screaming. Vance listened to the intercepted comms, and though he couldn't speak the language, he understood the tone perfectly. It was the sound of an overwhelming force encountering a predator it couldn't comprehend. "Dolan," Vance snapped. "Sweep the exterior." He checked the access ladder. Pierce reported, his jaw tight. Found partial footprints heading up to the old storage roof. Snow covered them almost instantly. She went up. Vance let out a slow breath. The wild card he had feared the most was currently the only reason they weren't all dead. He shoved his complicated feelings into a mental lockbox. "Nobody fires until I give the word. If Hayes is doing what I think she's doing, the worst thing we can do is reveal our positions." "What is she doing?" Sterling asked, wide-eyed. Vance watched the panicked heat signatures scattering like ants. "She's buying us time. Don't waste it." Harper was already past her 3rd shot. After the second officer fell, the enemy infantry had correctly attempted to disperse, plunging into thigh-deep snowdrifts. But in this terrain, dispersing only made them brighter targets on thermal. She ignored the infantry and targeted the communications hub vehicle. She rode a brief lull in the violent crosswind, treating the imperfect weather like a rock climber uses a jagged handhold. The communications hub went dark. The resulting chaos was immediate. Enemy soldiers began pointing their rifles at the obvious eastern ridgelines, 90 degrees and 400 meters away from Harper's actual nest. She felt a profound lack of emotion as she watched a four-man team trudge uselessly toward the empty horizon. They had just removed themselves from her threat board. "She's holding them," Pierce said, voicing the awe in the command room. "She's actually holding them." "Don't celebrate yet," Vance warned. But his internal math had radically shifted. It was no longer about delaying death. It was about shifting the paradigm of inevitability. He realized the quiet medic had accomplished more in 9 minutes than his defensive strategy could have achieved in 9 hours. Suddenly, Delgado caught a fleeting satellite window. "I've got Colonel Adler. It's breaking up, but he's there." Vance snatched the handset. "Adler, this is Vance. We are holding. Enemy column is stalled." Static roared. "Callahan, status. Say again." "We have an unknown asset engaged. Highly effective. I need an immediate extraction window. Cannot guarantee. 48 hours. Hold your position." The line went dead. The room fell into a suffocating silence. 48 hours. One woman against an armored battalion for 2 straight days. It was a mathematical impossibility. "She can't hold them for 48 hours, Sterling whispered, voicing their collective despair. "She doesn't have to," Vance replied, his eyes narrowing. "She just has to make their commanders decide that the cost of moving forward is far worse than the humiliation of standing still. She has to make them terrified to stand up." And that was exactly what Harper was doing. Major Sokolov, the reluctant new commander of the battered column, was crouched deep inside his armored hatch, sweating despite the freeze. He had ordered full comms silence, deployed flankers, and shifted to encrypted channels. And yet, the invisible sniper kept dismantling his leadership. He felt the third shot vibrate through the frozen earth as his comms officer collapsed. Sokolov ran the geometric angles in his head. The shots weren't coming from the obvious ridges. They were coming from the north, from the abandoned storage facility. "I need thermal on that storage structure," Sokolov barked into his radio. "Interference is too heavy, Major," his operator replied. "I see the structure, but I can't separate a human heat signature from the building's ambient bleed." Sokolov gritted his teeth. "Prep the artillery. I want a fire solution on Pokum." The fourth shot severed his sentence. It didn't hit a man. It obliterated the hardened optical targeting assembly on the turret of the vehicle directly to Sokolov's right. It was a threading-the-needle shot through a maze of steel. It was not suppressive fire. It was a terrifying, deliberate message. "I can see everything, and I choose what you lose." Sokolov's hands trembled on his radio. He had the firepower to wipe the American base off the map in 40 minutes. But he had no officers, no comms, a blinded artillery unit, and an invisible demon dismantling his life piece by piece. "Hold position," Sokolov choked out. "Nobody moves." Down in the base, Delgado gasped. "They're spreading out. Defensively. They've stopped advancing." "She made them think," Vance said grimly. "But thinking isn't retreating. The phantom moves." After crippling the targeting array, Harper abandoned her nest. She spider-crawled to a secondary hide she had scouted days prior. She settled in, recalculating the daunting new physics of a shifted 3,000-meter shot without a shred of adrenaline or panic. She checked her ammunition. She had enough to mangle their operational psychology, but not enough to wage a 48-hour war. She wasn't trying to win a war. She was trying to break their spirit. As she recalibrated, she allowed herself a rare, fleeting thought about the people shivering in the base below. She had watched Vance carry the crushing weight of leadership. She had seen Sterling's quiet bravery. She had watched Pierce comfort a wounded Beckett. She had spent a career aggressively avoiding attachment. It was flagged as a severe liability in her classified psychological profile. But in the frozen dark of this outpost, she had allowed the attachment to take root. She funneled that fierce protective care into her scope, translating human empathy into lethal precision. Major Sokolov was begging his superiors for a tactical retreat. Harper gave him exactly 30 seconds to state his case before she sent her fifth message. She threaded a geometrically impossible angle between two armored hulls, shattering the primary antenna array on the enemy's rear artillery vehicle. The artillery crew panicked, throwing their massive machine into a violent reverse to escape the kill box. The rear of the column fractured, retreating 50 meters and creating a massive gap in their formation. "The rear is pulling back!" Delgado cried, her voice cracking with pure shock. Beckett, leaning heavily on his fractured foot in the doorway, stared at the monitor. "Is she winning?" Vance shook his head slowly. "She's doing something much harder than winning. She's making them afraid of the dark." But Sokolov was a 26-year veteran. Humiliation eventually overrides caution. He gathered a war council mid-column, and Harper watched them cluster. She knew exactly how Sokolov's mind was working. He had two choices: die in disgrace, or change the geometry of the fight. Suddenly, two fast-moving personnel carriers tore away from the rear of the column, flanking wide to the west. They were hunting her. Harper had a rapidly shrinking window before the armored flankers compromised her northern elevation. She reached for a secondary, highly illegal tactical radio she kept hidden on her person. She keyed a frequency that wasn't on any official manifest and transmitted a terse, terrifying warning. Northern flank, 2 vehicles. Inside the base, a dormant secondary receiver on Delgado's desk suddenly hissed to life. The calm, icy voice hit the command room like a physical blow. Delgado stared at the radio dumbfounded. "Sergeant, that was Hayes." "I heard," Vance barked, instantly mobilizing. "Beckett, take Pierce. Northern approach. They're coming to flank Hayes. Slow them down." Beckett ignored his broken foot, his eyes hardening into flint. "Copy that." Delgado frantically keyed the radio back. "Hayes, this is base. We hear you. 2 men intercepting." "Copy," Harper's voice returned. "Tell them to stay low. Flankers have thermal." Vance listened to the exchange, profoundly humbled by the realization that Hayes had brought her own Ghost Network hardware, waiting for the precise moment when solo perfection wasn't enough. In the biting cold, Beckett and Pierce dragged massive 200-kilogram concrete barriers into the narrowest choke point of the northern drainage ditch. It wasn't an ambush. It was a psychological roadblock. Armored drivers don't run blind obstacles in hostile territory. They stop to assess. The lead vehicle hit the choke point and slammed its brakes. That hesitation bought Harper 3 precious minutes. She used them to shatter a forward sensor array and blow an external fuel coupling, spraying superheated steam into the blizzard. 2 more systems destroyed. 2 more crews mentally broken. Sokolov realized with horrifying clarity that the sniper wasn't shooting to kill. She was shooting to completely emasculate his column. He keyed his command channel to headquarters, his voice trembling with fury and dread, requesting a full intelligence review of the American base. He suspected a high-value operative was masquerading among the grunts. His commander's response was merciless. "You have 1 hour to resolve this, Major, or your career is over." "Flankers, 3 minutes." Harper's voice hissed over the radio. Vance's heart pounded. What is she going to do? Harper didn't wait for him to guess. "Base, this is Hayes. I need Beckett and Pierce at the eastern roof access. 30 seconds. They moved without question. When Pierce shoved open the roof hatch, he met the full, violent force of the blizzard. Harper Hayes was already crossing the ice in a low, terrifyingly fast spider crawl. She didn't look back at the encroaching roar of the flankers. She dropped down the ladder, moving with liquid grace, and began stripping her icy gear in the corridor. "Are you hurt?" Beckett asked, his breath ragged. "No," she said flatly. "They'll find the roof empty. It buys us 30 minutes of total confusion. But I need to get to my secondary hide, the northeast equipment shed." When she entered the command room, Vance handed her a canteen. She drank with mechanical efficiency. "You staged equipment in our shed?" Vance asked, stunned.
Day 5, Harper replied. The lock code is my bunk combination.
Delgado spun in her chair, staring at the woman with a profound, paradigm-shifting awe. Sterling muttered into the silence. "She's been running this entire war since she got off the helicopter."
Harper stared at the thermal feed. "When the satellite window opens, tell command we need the enemy's personnel roster cross-referenced against high-value target flags. If there is someone in that column worth more than this base, I need to know." Vance narrowed his eyes. "You're changing the strategy." "Disruption was phase 1, she said, her icy facade cracking just enough to reveal the crushing human burden of her true intent. Phase 2 is making sure they go home." But Sokolov wasn't finished. Desperate and out of time, he summoned a high-altitude aerial reconnaissance drone. In 40 minutes, the drone would strip away the blizzard, painting every heat signature in the base with inescapable clarity. Harper had anticipated this. She led Vance to the storage shed. Behind the dusty metal cabinet, she had meticulously carved a 4-centimeter slit in the insulation paneling, creating a perfect, invisible sniper loophole looking directly down the primary engagement corridor. She had built her endgame on day 5. She handed Vance a hyper-detailed, hand-drawn schematic of the base. "It's a thermal manipulation plan. I need you to fake a massive defensive buildup on the southern wall using our heating elements. Draw their artillery fire away from the personnel. I will have exactly 1 window to take my final shot before the drone locks onto my muzzle flash." Vance stared at the genius of the schematic. "And if it doesn't work?" Harper settled behind her rifle, her eyes locking onto the scope. "Then we deal with what's in front of us." Vance crouched beside her in the freezing dark. "You don't have to stay," she murmured. "I'm staying," Vance replied softly. "For the same reason you climbed that roof in the dark. Because these people are worth it." A profound silence filled the shed, heavier than the storm outside. "Yes," Harper whispered. "They are." "Lima 7 Alpha. Satellite window open," Delgado shouted. "Adler is transmitting the roster." Vance sprinted to the comms desk. The encrypted data bled across the screen. A specific flag code caught his eye. He stared at it, the puzzle pieces finally locking together into a picture of breathtaking scale. He keyed his mic. "Hayes, Vehicle 3. Command is tagging a Tier 1 intelligence asset, not a soldier. An analyst who has been butchering our forward operations for over a year. The name is corrupted, but the code is Lima 7 Alpha." The radio remained silent for 4 agonizing seconds. "I know the designation," Harper finally breathed. The weight in her voice was immense. "How?" Vance demanded softly. "Because finding Lima 7 Alpha is the entire reason I am here." The operations room froze. Every soldier suddenly understood. The incomplete files, the locked case, the baffling isolation. Harper Hayes hadn't been sent to save the base. The base was merely the bait. It was a sacrificial pawn designed to lure this specific Russian asset into the open. "You knew they were coming to kill us," Vance said, his voice thick with realization. "The intelligence suggested it," Harper replied, her tone devoid of apology. "But without Lima 7 Alpha, the enemy loses their absolute operational imperative. If he dies, they have no reason to bleed for this mountain." She fell silent, her eye pressed to the glass. "Vehicle 3 is repositioning. I am building the shot." Out on the icy road, Major Sokolov was orchestrating his final, desperate push.
Tucked safely inside the armored cocoon of Vehicle 3, the man known as Lima 7 Alpha gripped a satellite phone, frantically updating his superiors in Moscow. He was a man of expensive suits and sterile rooms, totally oblivious to the ghost holding her breath 900 meters away. As the command vehicles shifted, a minuscule gap opened between the heavy armor plating. It was a window of vulnerability that existed for exactly 2 seconds. Harper exhaled, finding the void. She pulled the trigger. The satellite phone shattered against the floorboards of Vehicle 3, slick with the sudden, violent ruin of Lima 7 Alpha. The chaos that erupted inside the Russian command network was entirely unhinged. It wasn't the disciplined panic of combat troops. It was the raw, screaming terror of untouchable elites suddenly realizing they were bleeding. Sokolov listened to the hysterical screaming on his comms for 5 seconds. He didn't need a formal report. He knew the ghost had just severed the head of his mission. He ran the risk assessment math one final time. The cost of this mountain had just become astronomically higher than the value of the dirt.
All vehicles. Sokolov ordered, his voice dead and hollow.
Execute full retrograde movement. We are withdrawing. Inside the shed, Harper listened to the massive gears grinding into reverse. She didn't move until she heard the distinct, fading crunch of retreating tracks. Slowly, she sat up, resting the hot rifle across her knees. Vance stood in the doorway, bathed in the dim gray light.
They're pulling back.
Yes, she whispered. Is it over? Harper looked down at her shaking, blistered hands. She looked up at Vance, and the impenetrable ice that had guarded her soul for 8 days finally melted. She looked like a woman who had carried an impossible mountain on her back and had finally been permitted to set it down.
Yes.
Over the comms, Sterling's voice broke into a jagged, overwhelming sob. She didn't say a word. She just wept the tears of the reprieved sliding down the eastern wall as the tension completely shattered. Pierce watched her, offering a single, profound nod. Column is at 5 kilometers, Delgado reported, her voice thick with raw, beautiful humanity. The road is empty, Sergeant. They are gone. The command room didn't erupt into Hollywood cheers. It dissolved into the quiet, exhausted reverence of the miraculously alive. Delgado buried her face in her arms. Navarro leaned heavily against the doorframe. Vance found Beckett patching his ruined foot. It's over, Vance said. Is she going to tell us who she really is? Beckett asked quietly. No, Vance replied, and I don't care. The extraction. When Vance addressed the exhausted unit later that morning, he didn't give a triumphant speech. He kept it strictly tactical. But before he could dismiss them, Sterling stepped forward, looking directly at Harper. I don't know who you are, the young private said, her voice shaking but fiercely resolute. I don't know your real name or what your file says, and I don't care. I just need you to know that I am breathing right now because of you, and I will never, ever forget it. Harper stared at the young girl. For a terrifying, beautiful moment, the ghost vanished. A soft, devastatingly human gratitude touched the corners of her eyes. Thank you, Harper whispered. Same, Pierce echoed. Same, Beckett grunted from his chair. Every soldier in the room offered their quiet, absolute reverence. Hours later, an encrypted transmission from Colonel Adler confirmed their extraction timeline. It also included a heavily redacted personnel query response. It confirmed the assassination of Lima 7 Alpha, and in a final, unofficial addendum, Adler noted that the operation's impossible success mirrored the tactical footprint of a legendary Tier 1 operative, an operative who had officially died in a failed extraction 3 years ago, an operative whose codename was Stillwater. Vance read the file, walked into the mess hall, and sat across from Harper. She was quietly reading a small, worn notebook. "Still water," Vance said softly. Harper closed the book. She didn't confirm it. She didn't deny it. She just held his gaze with the steady, unbreakable calm of a phantom. 22 hours until the birds arrive," Vance said, nodding once in ultimate respect.
22 hours, she agreed.
When the heavy rescue chopper finally beat its way through the breaking clouds the next morning, Vance counted his people one by one as they scrambled aboard. 10 living, breathing souls. Harper boarded last. She clutched the black case in her left hand and took the seat nearest the exit, an old, unbreakable habit. As the chopper banked hard, tearing them away from the frozen hellscape, the mountain below began to swallow the tracks of the Russian armor, erasing the history of the impossible war they had waged. Sterling caught Harper's eye across the vibrating cabin. The young private held the gaze, silently promising the ghost that she was seen. Truly seen. Harper looked back out the window at the endless white expanse. But just before she turned away, the faintest ghost of a smile touched her lips. She was flying toward another base, another false name, and another unit that had no idea she was coming. She lived in the shadows, written off as dead by the country she served. But as she listened to the breathing of the 10 soldiers she had pulled from the jaws of hell, Stillwater knew exactly why she remained in the dark. Because the math of saving them was the only truth she had left.